As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
Welcome back to another episode of The Malcolm Effect. Joining me is a voice you are familiar with, Professor Bikrum Gill. I'm super excited to be having this conversation on a topic that you cannot hear me shut up about, imperialism. Imperialism, which is important because when we're thinking about the genocide and what's going on in the world today, we have to point at imperialism. So, welcome back to the Malcolm Effect, Professor Bikrum Gill. How are you?
I'm good. Glad to be back. Glad to have this discussion with you. Thanks for having me back on.
Thank you so much, Professor Uncle Comrade. So we always talk about imperialism. People will often say, but imperialism has always existed. So when we say imperialism, we want to adopt an anti-imperialist politics, orientation, and praxis. What do we mean? So essentially, I'm asking, how do you define imperialism, and what then distinguishes imperialism in the capitalist phase?
Okay, so how I define imperialism at its core, at its fundamental, is imperialism is about the denial of sovereignty to a people. So a denial of sovereign power to a people over their territory. So it is essentially when a political power, an organized form of political power, a political entity, a state or empire, organizes a system through which it is able to usurp the sovereignty of other peoples, who it then organizes into a periphery or marginal sort of location in relation to the dominating political power or imperialist power. So just maybe before going on, one thing that will help here is to very quickly define what I mean by sovereignty, right? So sovereignty, what that implies is, what I mean by that is, does a people who has power over the use of resources and labor in a territory. So, and how can we identify who has that power? To what imperatives or in service of what interests are resources being mobilized and utilized? So we can look at that. So when a people over a territory lose sovereign power over their territory, that means their resources or the organization of their social life is now not in service of the reproduction of their own societies, but in service of another imperative. Now, if I can briefly distinguish this from colonialism, it can help us understand imperialism even more so. So colonialism is very similar. It is about the denial of sovereignty, the usurpation of sovereignty. But colonialism, I like to think of as applying more to a one-to-one relationship. So the British colonial, say, usurpation of sovereignty of India, the French over Algeria or Vietnam, the Portuguese over Mozambique and Angola, and so on. These are colonial forms of domination that are one-to-one, but they exist within a broader imperialist world system. And imperialism can contain colonialism, but it need not have a direct one-to-one colonial relationship. So imperialism is more, I would like people to think about it more as a systemic scale, either regional or world systemically, through which a core state or a set of core states, let's say in Europe, in the global north, are able to systematically, whether through a one-to-one colonial relationship or through other means, deny sovereignty to the peripheries of the imperialist world system, again, in order to reorganize those peripheries so that their resources and the organization of their societies and economies are done in service of the imperial core. So that is how I understand imperialism. Does that sound clear before I move on to thinking about its specificity under capitalism?
Yes, thank you so much. So please go into what makes it specific. When we say anti-imperialism in our contemporary era, what do we mean?
So in our era, imperialism is an imperialism that is of a specific type, which is capitalist imperialism. Okay, so capitalism is a political economic system that I will begin with a definition that we can take from both Karl Marx, but also Giovanni Arrighi, Fernand Braudel, and others. So capitalism is a system that is defined, as Marx says, by when the state political power is held by the capitalist class. So the ruling class of a state is the capitalist class. And a capitalist economy, a capitalist state, is itself organized in service of the interests of the capitalist class. And what is the interest of the capitalist class? Well, a capitalist class is the ruling class of capitalism, and what it seeks is profits. It seeks accumulation. Okay, so the objective of the capitalist class is to grow its capital. Now, we can think, what is capital, right? To understand capitalism, and this will help us understand imperialism. What is capital? So capitalism emerges and it's premised upon a relationship, a capital relationship. And the capital relationship is a relationship of capital labor. Okay. Now we will see very shortly that capital labor is a contradictory relationship. And the contradictions of this relationship are what necessitate for there to be imperialism is the foundation of capitalism. So capitalism, as I was mentioning, it's run by a capitalist class that is driven by a search for more profits and more accumulation. So let's break that down a little bit. So at its core, this relationship, as I was saying, is a capital-labor relationship. So what is that relation? It is a relation that comes into being through a historical process of violent enclosure through which peoples lose access to land and other forms of reproducing their lives outside of the market. Okay, so it leads to the creation of a dispossessed laboring class, and it leads to the creation, enclosure, or this is what Marx calls primitive accumulation. On the other side, it leads to the creation of a capitalist class. So those who enclose land, those who by force enclose the means of production and monopolize them, this becomes the capitalist class. Now, they have now in their possession at this point the entirety of the means of producing the goods and services and other outputs that are core to our overall social reproduction. So the production of food, the production of clothing, the production of machinery, the means to do this is now all in the hands of the capitalist class. But the capitalist class cannot set production in motion and actually produce any output, of course, without a laboring class. But they exercise power over this laboring class because this laboring class must sell itself to the capitalist class, sell its labor power to the capitalist class because it has no other means of securing food or shelter or basic forms of social reproduction now outside of the market. So this capital-labor relationship then, it proceeds and it unfolds through this relation of power of capital over labor. Now, although so if a laborer will go and sell their labor now to the capitalist can say to the laborer, I will pay you, say they employ the worker for 10 hours now, maybe they'll only pay the worker for 2 or 4 hours of that day, and all of the surplus product that is produced will be appropriated by the capitalist. And so this is what is referred to as surplus value. So the capitalist generates surplus value, but it can really only realize surplus value if it's able to sell those products that are produced through this relationship on the market. But this is where the contradiction sharpens, because if capital is exploiting labor and it's driving down the wages of labor, it's also reducing its market size through which it can realize more profits and more accumulation. And so there's a problem here. The worker must eat, the worker must be clothed, so the worker must purchase these goods, and after reproducing their life, you would like the worker to purchase even more goods. So there's a contradiction between reproducing the laborer and realizing profit. So how can you reduce the reproduction costs of the worker and continue to realize profits and reproduce the labor at the same time? So this is where the system is actually very irrational. Just before I move on to imperialism, what I can say is this problem arises out of the fact that capitalism is based on the total dispossession of the working class. This is what we'll see. We'll see in episode 3. This is different than, say, the Chinese system today, which is not based on the total dispossession of the working class. And that actually introduces more rational market dynamics than exist in a capitalist system. So the dispossession of the working class, it is kind of an irrational basis of the market system. It doesn't actually lead to rational market competition. It leads to this contradiction that can only be stabilized now if you can secure food for the worker, if you can secure raw industrial inputs that can lower the cost of production without having to necessarily lower the wages of the worker to the extent that they can't consume. So let me give you an example of this, right? So suppose the worker's wages are too low for it to both purchase food and clothing and other goods. Well, if you can lower the price of good now, you've increased the disposable income of the worker. So if you can bring food for the worker, suppose the way in which the British Empire was able to drain wheat from India in the 19th century to Manchester, and that wheat is very cheap because you're not really paying the peasants growing the wheat in India really anything. It's just an outright theft. It's an outright appropriation from there because you're not concerned with reproducing the social life of the peasant in India. So you're able to drain cheap goods to the imperial core. And by doing that, then you're able to stabilize this contradiction. So imperialism functions to stabilize this contradiction by denying sovereignty in total to the peoples of the periphery through economic and military force. And in that way, the peoples of the periphery lose because they don't have sovereign control or power over their land, over their labor, over their territory, over their economic processes. Then they're subject to the drain of value and wealth to the imperial core to service the interests of economic development and capitalist development in the core. So then anti-imperialism in this sense is at its fundamental level about the reclamation of sovereignty from imperialist powers. And to do so, to really reclaim sovereignty, is to create the material conditions that overcome the dependency that the imperialist power generates for the imperialist periphery.
I guess to follow up on that, I think what's interesting is that you noted earlier, colonialism can exist within a system of imperialism. And there's a famous work by Lenin, Imperialism, the High Stage of Capitalism. So then what do we make of that? Is imperialism something to be defined within both inside and outside of capitalism? And what is meant by imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism in its relation to finance capital?
So I think for Lenin, imperialism emerges as a specific stage. And I think this is where it's important to distinguish Lenin from what might be called the world systems tradition or the tradition of third world Marxism. Because for Lenin, imperialism, really, the imperialism he talks about, the new imperialism, is a stage that emerges in the 19th century. Once capitalism itself progresses or degenerates, whatever language you want to use there, to a stage of what Lenin calls monopoly capitalism. So what they'll look at is like maybe at the early stages of capitalism, you do have intense market competition between capitalist firms, but over time, that competition will give rise to monopoly ownership. So the firms that are winning in that competition will end up establishing monopoly ownership over entire sectors of production. And actually for Lenin, it's not even just the industrial capitalist that is of import here, but the bank capital that stands behind the industrial capitalist. So for Lenin, there's like a merger of bank capital, finance capital, and industrial capital. And finance capital and industrial capital, finance capital is motivated not to realize profits out of production, but to simply realize profit out of, say, the issuing of loans, out of interest payments, and etc. And another distinguishing feature of finance capital is how mobile it is as compared to more immobile industrial capital. But the key point here is for Lenin, the emergence of monopoly capital in the 19th century really intensifies that contradiction I just spoke about, because now you have even more accumulation of capital in even fewer hands. And this concentration of capital in the hands of monopoly finance capitalists in the 19th century it leads to a crisis where they now need to find more markets through which to realize value from this overaccumulated capital, and they need to open up these other markets by force, right? So this is what Lenin argues leads to imperialism. You have an overaccumulation of capital in the 19th century. Because those contradictions I spoke to you about, I just spoke about earlier, they accelerate and they intensify. And then by the stage of monopoly capital, there's like an existential risk to capital because there's such an overaccumulation of capital in such few hands that it needs a release of that overaccumulated capital needs to find profits elsewhere, and it can only do so through imperialism. And this is what motivates the imperialism of the scramble for Africa in the late 19th century, of the Opium Wars, of the subjugation of China, eventually of World War I, is this need to find a profitable outlet for that overaccumulated capital, which comes through imperialism. And then what imperialism does, it allows for the export of that overaccumulated capital in the core that doesn't have an outlet for profitability in the core. It allows for it to be exported to the colonies, to the imperialist periphery, where now it can be put to work and generate super profits out of the super exploitation of that labor we just talked about, of this category of labor in the colony, in the imperialist periphery, which can be exploited at a scale that the labor in the core cannot be exploited. So it allows monopoly capital to regenerate the conditions for profitability, regenerate the conditions for surplus value accumulation. But the problem that, say, somebody like Samir Amin may have with Lenin, and Amin builds on Lenin, or say Giovanni Arrighi will have on Lenin, is that they will argue that Lenin mistakes a moment in a cycle of capitalist accumulation for a stage. So that, I guess the difference is, like, say, Arrighi's work, he doesn't look at capitalism moving linearly, right? So Lenin's saying in the early capitalism, you have intense competition, you do have the space for accumulation and profits until it reaches its monopoly stage. Whereas for Arrighi, capitalist accumulation moves through cycles, and imperialism has always been the foundation of capitalism. And I would share the position of Arrighi and Amin and the world system scholars and even third world Marxists who will argue, like the Patnaiks in the recent book, that you can never have a capitalist system. Capitalism will always be stuck in simple reproduction without imperialism. So imperialism is not the highest stage of capitalism. Imperialism is the base and foundation of capitalism, that you always must have the ability to drain wealth from a periphery to the core to be able to subsidize, provide a colonial subsidy to the dispossessed working class in the core to be able to stabilize this contradiction. Now, that doesn't mean Lenin was entirely wrong. It just means that what he identified imperialism as a stage, imperialism is actually always there, but this may be an evolution of imperialism at the point at which Lenin is speaking about it. But I think what is still important from Lenin that we can take is how imperialism is not simply about pillaging land, about pillaging territory, but it's also about exporting overaccumulated capital to the periphery, through which then you can drain economic value from periphery to core. And there's a difference between Lenin and Luxemburg, who Ali Kadri is going to build off of, which I can speak about now or can wait till later.
I think let's move on to some of these different theoretical differences, because I think it's really good to clarify how imperialism is defined differently within different ideological camps. So I think we should definitely go into those other folks.
Okay, so what I can say is, one way to think about the difference between Lenin and Luxemburg is, so for Lenin, and I think Lenin's theory of imperialism will be very, I think, influential eventually for the dependency school and the world system school, because Lenin is looking not just at force, but he's looking at how imperialism operates through economic exchange. So, for Lenin, there's a potentially maybe progressive or productive component to imperialism here. You see, so you have the export of capital, and the export of capital, say from Germany or the British Empire or France, it's going to the colony now because it can't find profitable outlets in the core anymore. So now it goes to the colony to try to realize super profits. But as it goes to the colony, that export capital will be put to use. It may build railroads or it may build factories there. And in so doing, it is going to generate outputs, it's going to generate production, but obviously it's going to appropriate the great mass of value from that back to the core. Now, what is distinct about Luxembourg, I think, and Kadri is going to then build on this in a way, and I think even deepen some of Luxembourg's insights and depart, is Luxembourg is going to return us to something that maybe I should have started with earlier, but Luxembourg is really going to center the role of violence and war in imperialism. Now, Kadri, of course, in recent years has advanced the very strong, in some ways provocative, unsettling thesis that at its core, imperialism is about violence and war. And that should make us question, well, what is capitalism about if imperialism is about war and violence? But so let me quickly return to Luxembourg here. So for Luxembourg, capitalism, what Luxembourg focuses on is the crises of capitalism. Right? That capitalism, again, I don't need to rehash it, but for the reasons I said, the contradictions I talked about, that it leads to overaccumulation crisis, right? Where eventually capitalism does not have a way to recycle its profits back into production to realize more profits because of this problem of how it exploits the working class, how it drives down the wages of the working class. So it has limited market size. It needs to access cheaper resources to stabilize these contradictions. Luxembourg says this is what leads capitalist states then to engage in war with the non-capitalist world, right? So it's a little different from Lenin. She doesn't focus on the export of capital as maybe a process of dull economic compulsion, but she focuses more war and violence, right? And what Luxembourg really thinks about here is that through war, what matters, and this is Kadri's going to pick this up from Luxembourg, is that what war will accomplish, what imperialism will accomplish through war is the destruction of societies in the periphery, is the destruction of the social reproduction capacities of societies on the peripheries. Now, what does this do? This releases a mass of labor, Luxembourg will argue, and this will integrate now labor in the peripheries that has no means of reproduction. So if you smash the state, if you smash all the industry, that's different. We can see from Lenin, right? Lenin, you're exporting capital to either take over existing industry or maybe even generate new ones. Luxembourg says imperialism is about smashing industry. It's about smashing social organization in order then to cheapen labor power, cheapen the price of labor, right? So again, that can address that contradiction of capitalism between how do you realize profits and lower the price of labor when you need a consuming class as well. So here you can cheapen the cost of labor to such a degree that then it opens up access to foodstuffs that can allow workers in the core, again, to feed themselves and still have money left over to buy products on the market. So it's a violent process that's about destruction, not necessarily construction. So if that distinction makes sense between Luxembourg and Lenin in some ways, right? And so not only does it cheapen the price of labor, it then also opens up, right, access to resources now that are not utilized by the industries of the people who have been dominated. So if you had local industry before and you smash those industries and you disorganize those societies, it opens those resources now to claim and use by the imperialist power, but at a very cheap price, right? So I think that's maybe a difference between Lenin and Luxembourg, is Lenin is focusing on the export of capital that might generate productive power, but of course the value of that is appropriated, whereas Luxembourg is focusing on a violence and a war, a war-making power underneath imperialism that is about destruction, that is about releasing cheap labor and resources. And of course, we can see how the two approaches can work together, but it's important to understand their difference. And then Kadri is going to build on this. If I can, and you guys can edit this out if you do edit it or whatever afterwards, but if I can just maybe return to something here, is that I think what the importance of Luxembourg and Kadri is, and maybe, again, I should have mentioned this earlier, is that what they remind us is that imperialism and maybe capitalism itself at its base is maybe really about violence. It's about what we're seeing today in the return to genocidal war, that the foundation of this system and what it seeks in its reproduction is violent domination and even elimination and the threat of genocidal elimination to peoples under imperialist power. Right. So this is, if I can return, to the early eras of capitalist imperialism, another thinker, Enrique Dussel, he argues that capitalist imperialism is an irrational system that presents itself as a myth of rational. There's a rational myth it forwards, but it's actually very irrational because what it builds itself on is violent enclosure and genocidal violence with other peoples, right? And on that foundation, it constructs trade agreements, it constructs treaties or ceasefires, but that those treaties or agreements never come through rational intercourse or discourse. It is built on violence and the threat of elimination. So, that is the maybe the foundation of the entire system of capitalist imperialism. If we follow the line from, say, Dussel to Luxemburg to Ali Kadri, who I think is very important to understanding the imperialism of the contemporary moment. Now, if I can introduce one more thinker here, who I think is very important, it's I mentioned Amin. There's another theorist of imperialism, Giovanni Arrighi, who I think is very important maybe to help us further understand imperialism. Arrighi is going to argue that the imperialism under capitalism, what really matters here, okay, and is that imperialism is about sovereign power over the flow of capital between territories. So if you can recall earlier, when I'm distinguishing imperialism and colonialism, what really matters for imperialism under capitalism is not necessarily if you deny sovereign power over a territory. So peoples can still maybe have formal sovereign control over their territories, but you can deny them sovereign power over the entry and exit of core technologies, of capital, of energy into and out of their territory, without which it is nearly impossible for them to undertake economic development. So I think in addition to what we've been talking about, if we add Giovanni Arrighi's understanding of what imperialism really is under capitalism, it's a sovereign power over capital, sovereign power over the flow of capital between territories, between points of production. That really matters, because if you don't have that sovereign power, then even if you're formally independent, you will remain dependent on the imperial core, and that dependency will reproduce the conditions through which they can drain value from your territory. So I think Arrighi is also very important to our discussion of imperialism, as are Amin and the Patnaiks, but I feel like I should maybe kind of turn it back to you guys.
I was going to say, maybe we can go into Samir Amin and the Patnaik's understanding of imperialism.
Yeah, so I think with what I would say with the definition that Arrighi provides, I think Amin will also be very important here. What I like about Amin is especially in his later works on contemporary imperialism, Mamadou, the question you began with on anti-imperialism, this essay he writes, The Sovereign Popular Project. What Amin really, I think, foregrounds for us, again, when he's kind of working with Lenin, but trying to remind students of Lenin that actually imperialism is not a stage, it's the foundation of capitalism. Amin, of course, and this is something I've mentioned often in my own work, but Amin, of course, talks about imperialism as being founded and as walking on two legs, right? There's two foundations of imperialism, a military and an economic leg. The military leg, and this is, I think, going back to your original question on what is an anti-imperialism. So the military leg simply, clarifies for us, right, that imperialism is about the usurpation of sovereignty. Now, at its core, this happens by applying greater force to a territory. The imperialist power is able to usurp sovereign power over a territory by being able to demonstrate that it is the sovereign power, that it is the power that is able to apply the most force over that territory. So there's a military basis to sovereignty that Amin points to. Now, through that military domination, the capitalist imperialist power reorganizes the subjugated territory in such a way, again, if we think about Luxembourg, you destroy that territory, and then you drain wealth from that territory to the core. which then introduces the economic leg of imperialism for Amin. And this economic leg is very similar to the one I was talking about with Origi. So what the economic leg is essentially is that I think Amin's economic leg is essentially the core of Origi's definition that we just spoke about, right? That imperialism is able to deny sovereignty, now not simply through military force, but by making access to economic capital for the periphery dependent upon the core. Now, if you do that, if again you're in Niger and you have so much uranium, but you have no way of processing that uranium now, and you can only do that by accessing capital and technology from France, well, those French firms and the French capitalist state can impose conditions in terms of trade, in terms of investment, that lead to massive surplus value drain from Niger to France, as an example, right? So I think that's the economic leg, and then there's this military leg. That is something that I think Amin really introduces, and I think by introducing, again, this question of force, what Amin argues is that this enables imperialism to appropriate surplus value by paying labor in the periphery less than what you would pay labor in the core, right? Because of this differential degree of sovereign force there. Now, the Patnaiks, I think what they introduce for us is a very clear understanding, and I won't rehash it. A lot of what I was talking about at the beginning around the contradictions of capitalism, how capitalism can't reproduce itself without imperialism. I'm taking that from the Patnaiks, especially their recent book, Capital and Imperialism. But what the Patnaiks will really introduce here is how imperialism is able to stabilize that contradiction of capitalism in the core, okay, by reducing inflation. Again, by reducing the costs of core goods in the core, like we talked about, foodstuffs, clothing, and etc. And you reduce inflation in the core, you reduce the threat that inflation poses to profits and money in the core by draining cheap goods from the periphery, and you do that by imposing prices. This is a category that Patnaiks call the price-taking class. So if labor in the core is still able to bargain for wages, in the periphery, they simply take prices. So the peasantry in the periphery is a price-taking class. It takes prices that are imposed by the core, and this leads to the export of cheap grains, of cheap industrial inputs from the core, from the periphery to the core. So I think that's how we can integrate, let's say, the Patnaiks and Amin.
Thank you. I'll give it to Christian before I go.
I guess I know you started to answer the question around anti-imperialism, but given that there's so many, I think, theoretical differences by various figures regarding the question of imperialism, how do you feel like different projects speak to those various theoretical differences? Because I think the ultimate test of the theoretical difference then becomes the practice. So I'm interested how different anti-imperialist projects are based off of these various interpretations of imperialism.
Yeah, I think that's I think that's like the crux, that question, right? Like I think that's really core to how we think about. We can call them anti-imperialist projects. We can call them projects of sovereign national development, right? So I think at the core, though, like where I started, what unifies all of these theories, whether it's Lenin or Luxemburg or Kadri or Amin or the Patnaiks, is how can people who've been subjugated by imperialism, whether the direct colonial one-to-one relationship, whether indirectly through economic dependency, how can a people reclaim sovereignty? So you can, now the immediate way this has been theorized. I mean, okay, let me break this down a different way. There are actually, Christian, there have been debates on this, right? So you can think about, let's start with Lenin. Now, Lenin has a theory of imperialism, but for Lenin, this also gives rise to a theory of anti-imperialism. And we know the Soviet Union became a bulwark for anti-imperialism in the 20th century. So now, for Lenin, as he's thinking through, and to understand how his book on imperialism, his pamphlet on imperialism, gives rise to his work on anti-imperialism, Lenin starts to think through this thing called the national question. He has a thesis on the national and colonial questions that he presents to the Communist International. Now, this thesis is essentially about what we're talking about. How do you, now if Lenin's mapped out imperialism, then how do you map out anti-imperialism? How do you reclaim sovereignty? So for Lenin, what is most important is the first step is for people to reclaim political sovereignty. And for communists in the core, what they need to do is they need to understand that there's a national question and a social question. So within the colonies, you have the denial of national sovereignty by the imperialist core. Now, this process has led to or has built itself on top of already existing or generated new class antagonisms within the colony. But for Lenin, what is most imperative here is that that the communists support national sovereign reclamation first, and then attend to the class question in the colony second. So if it's the bourgeois class in the colony that comes to be at the lead anti-imperialism, decolonization, and sovereign reclamation, then you support that. And then once the bourgeois have come to power, then you can start to think about the question, proletarian revolution, and the class question. What is most important is the sovereignty question for Lenin, right? And again, for Lenin, this is important too, because without addressing imperialism, you're never going to have revolution in the core either. The workers are going to continue to be bought off by imperialism. Now, this approach by Lenin was actually contested by M.N. Roy in the debates on the International, and I think later on by Fanon and even Mao, right? So from the third world, from the peripheries, people look back at those struggling for sovereignty engage Lenin, they build from Lenin, they're inspired by the victory of the Soviet Union, but at the same time, there is a questioning of whether a bourgeois leadership of a sovereign project can actually help you overcome the conditions of imperialism, or put differently, can help you create the conditions for real sovereignty. And why that is that the decolonized space, once you even get independence, you still confront a problem of a lack of capital, because the imperial powers, the colonial powers, have appropriated all capital from you. And now you may be looking at independence, but how do you overcome economic dependence? And for Fanon and for Mao and even M.N. Roy, you can't do that with bourgeois leadership. It requires the leadership of the peasant and proletariat classes, because the bourgeois class will simply continue to reproduce the colonial structure of the economy, allow for the reproduction of the drain of wealth, allow for exports to the core, while it can maintain its share of profits. Whereas if you put the peasantry at the center, if you put land reform at the center, you can start to generate domestic capital in small amounts. You can start to generate different accumulation strategies that can help you overcome economic dependence. So I think there's a way in which, I think Fanon and Mao rework or innovate or advance the program that comes out of Lenin's reading of imperialism. And so what I would say is what comes out of the more Maoist, Fanonian, even what M.N. Roy is saying, this kind of third worldist approach to imperialism, is it centers the necessity, nationalization, peasant-centered land reform as core to this. And I think if you build off of Amin, it brings those two legs together. If imperialism walks on two legs, so does anti-imperialism. And so a peasant-centered anti-imperialist revolution or decolonial revolution is a revolution that is necessarily violent, unlike a bourgeois decolonial anti-imperial project. It's necessarily violent because it's attacking the very property relations through which imperialism operated on the ground. So it's challenging the military leg of imperialism and simultaneously generating conditions to challenge the economic leg of imperialism. Now, the great challenge, and we can come to this in later episodes, but the great challenge of the 20th century that was not addressed, that maybe we're in the midst of seeing today, is that you did not have a sufficient challenge to imperialism in the sense that Arrighi spells it out to us, or in the sense that I'm laying it out today. Imperialism is not a one-to-one relationship. So if you are an Algeria or a Vietnam or a Mozambique or Angola, and you achieve formal independence out of that one-to-one relationship, but now you're in an imperialist world system where, again, the defining question is sovereign power, not over territory, but over the flow of capital between territory and between production units, because that is what generates dependency. So how do you generate the conditions for sovereignty at that level? how do you challenge military and economic power at the international scale? I don't believe that was ever sufficiently addressed in the 20th century. I don't believe the means or the capability were there. But I think the irony or the contradiction of the era of US imperialism is that underneath the noses of US imperialism, you saw the conditions start to be generated for a world scale challenge to imperialism through something like the rise of China and through something like the military contestation that Iran and the Axis posed in West Asia, maybe Russia poses in Eurasia, and so on. So I think those are some ways in which some of the concrete projects can be seen to be related to some of these theories, and these theories come out of these projects as well. You know, we know that Amin and Arrighi, for example, were in close conversation with many of these projects in China, on the African continent, and elsewhere.
Christian, do you have a follow-up?
No, I think that was wonderful. I think we can go ahead.
Thank you so much. Okay, so Nen, given what we've spoken about and all of our definitions, when we say US imperialism, what do we mean? When did the US become an imperialist?
Okay, so I mean, I would say that's a very important question. So when did the U.S. become imperialist? Well, again, I guess in some ways we can think about the United States as a settler colony in its inception that is born within, like I was saying, that analytical framework we can think about the U.S. as a settler colony within a broader imperialist system where imperialist hegemony or the main power is not with the United States initially. It is with, say, the Dutch or the British. Okay, so now the United States, when does it become imperialist? You can think about the 19th century history of the American state. You can think about the American state, let's say very briefly, let's take a step back. The United States as a state, it's founded in 1776, of course, with the U.S. Revolution. Now, the U.S. Revolution is a revolution that is presented often, and I'll just say it, I think it's misread and misunderstood by those who are associated with this trend called mega communism or patriotic communism or something, whatever words they're using. Right? So, but they misunderstand, they misread the American Revolution as a progressive revolution because they think that it is challenging and overturning feudal forms of power, that it is challenging the British monarchical power. That's what they think is at the core of the American Revolution. But in fact, if you read the work of Gerald Horne, Dominic Losordo, and others, you will see that actually the U.S. Revolution was itself based upon trying to reestablish the denial of sovereignty to indigenous peoples in America and to Black people in America. So this is, the American Revolution happens after the 1763, what indigenous peoples in North America called the Two-Row Wampum, with a British crown called the Royal Proclamation, where there's an agreement, and I just want to be very brief about this because I don't think this history is really understood about the U.S. state. The British crown comes to an agreement with indigenous peoples in part because they cannot militarily subjugate them during the Anglo-French Wars, the 7-Year War. There's also British Indian Wars, British Indigenous Wars, where they're not able to subjugate indigenous people. So they make an agreement in 1763. We will no longer expand westward past the continental divide, okay, the eastern divide. And the settler colonists, and that's another interesting point, is that at times settler colonists operate in coherence with imperialism. At times there's contradictions. And we can think about that in relation to Zionism today, right? But the settler colonists in the United States are furious at the British Crown. When they say no taxation without representation, actually what is really fueling a lot of the anger of the U.S. Revolution is the anger that the British Crown would take away their right to steal and pillage indigenous land. George Washington was a land pillager and a land speculator. He made so much wealth by stealing indigenous land and then speculating on it. So there's a material relationship between the quote-unquote U.S. revolutionaries and the reproduction of that denial of sovereignty to indigenous people. So this is what's fueling the American quote-unquote revolution, actually. It's to reestablish the violent conditions through which sovereignty is denied to indigenous peoples and Black peoples in America. And, this will eventually lead after the revolution to what are called, quote unquote, the Indian Wars, right? The 19th century genocidal kind of wars of extermination and displacement through which the United States expands westward. And the only reason I'm kind of giving this backstory is in some ways the United States will expand all the way to the West Coast to California, and then a lot of scholarship will emphasize how it's from there that the United States will then start to actually expand beyond this. But the origins of U.S. imperialism in many ways are the Indian Wars, right? That they internalized imperialism into a continental state, and actually that is what gives the U.S. state its competitive, quote unquote, competitive advantage over the German state in replacing British imperialism. It's because the United States has access to this massive territory in the Midwest and beyond, through which it's able to outcompete its rivals. And that's a story for another time, but this is what gives rise to the U.S. corporation, actually. So you have this key component. Another key component of U.S. imperialism, to briefly just mention, is actually, and this is something that for people to understand would come out of W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction, his book on Black Reconstruction. Well, he'll emphasize that the way in which the quote unquote end of slavery in the United States, it gives rise to a moment in which the emancipation of Black people is attached to what I was just talking about, land reclamation in the South, which could have led to a form of sovereignty for Black people in the United States. But of course, the U.S. state rejects this and refuses this premise and actually takes the land back from freed Black people. And this is, I think, going to be the roadmap for CIA counter-revolutionary activity in terms of interrupting land reform in the U.S. Across the world in the 20th century. So, the U.S. imperialism will have these antecedents, will have these foundations. But at a world systemic scale, the United States really becomes the imperialist power after World War II. Okay, that's where it's really important to understand the rise of the United States as the global imperialist power. Now, why is the United States the imperialist power? Well, in some ways, the U.S. stands alone after World War II. Europe is destroyed. Russia has been destroyed. Of course, the colonies are just standing back up on their feet or just struggling to get decolonization. The United States is the overwhelming economic and military power of the world in the mid-20th century. And the United States, its imperialism, it becomes of a sort that Samir Amin will end up calling a collective imperialism. Okay, so what's distinct about U.S. imperialism in the mid-20th century, it's this overwhelming power. The challenge the U.S. faces that the British did not face and the Dutch did not face before them as the preceding imperialist hegemons, what the challenge the U.S. faces, it now confronts both an organized form of labor that has state power in the Soviet communist bloc, and they're confronting a challenge to the other register of capitalist power, which is imperialism, as decolonized peoples start to reclaim sovereignty. So the United States now will emerge as an imperialist power that's seeking to manage an imperialist world system, seeking to reproduce and intensify that drain of wealth from the periphery to the core, but now confronting a stronger form of anti-imperialism and class struggle than any previous imperialist hegemon had to do. And so the United States is going to actually have to, in some ways, it is some ways hemmed in by this. So why does the United States sponsor land reform in South Korea and Japan? It's because there's a fear that the Chinese Revolution is going to spread throughout Asia. But on the other hand, the U.S. imperialism is premised from its outset on using military power, covert power, economic power to undermine projects of sovereign reclamation, right? So you can think about the way the United States undertakes coup d'etats in Iran, in Guatemala, in the 1950s, at the outset of its era of imperialism, in order to reproduce that drain of wealth, in order to reproduce conditions of economic dependency, because we know the sin of Iran was to nationalize its oil in 1953. The sin of Guatemala in 1954 was to try to undertake land reform that would redistribute land from U.S. fruit plantations to indigenous Mayans who had been dispossessed for centuries. So the U.S. introduces a form of military and economic intervention that is not necessarily, like Luxemburg would say at the time, about expanding in order to address the contradictions and crises of capitalism in the core, but it's to actually respond to anti-imperialist struggle, to contain anti-imperialist struggle, to renew those founding conditions. So that is one thing, in some ways, that's distinct about U.S. imperialism. But where I think U.S. imperialism, as we need to understand it today, it's really going to take its form is from the 1970s onwards. So, again, in those opening decades of US imperial power from post-World War II to the 1970s, the United States is the overwhelming economic and military power. It's able to reestablish and renew the drain of wealth, etc., as I talked about, with interventions in Iran and Guatemala and elsewhere. It will impose sanctions on Cuba for the similar sort of reasons. But by the 1970s, the United States is going to confront a crisis. Okay, the United States is going to confront a crisis of profitability that seems similar to the late 19th century crisis of profitability that led to Lenin and Luxemburg's theories. But the question here is, the specific crisis the United States faces is one in which now you have German and Japanese competition eating into U.S. profits, okay, the profits of U.S. firms, but also as much as the U.S. is trying to contain global South states, contain their ability to establish sovereignty over their resources, nonetheless, by the 1970s, you have had the setting in motion of sovereign development projects that are also then eating into the profits of firms in the U.S. and in Europe, right? So you're having this profitability crisis emerge. And the United States is not actually able to compete with Japanese and German automotive engineering, for example, or construction firms, et cetera, right? So what the United States will end up doing in the 1970s is reestablishing its imperialist power, which again is the power at its core over the control of the flow of capital between territories. And it will do this by establishing a close relationship between the US dollar and oil. It is through this that the US will reestablish both hegemonic power vis-a-vis Japan and Germany, and it will establish imperialist financial power over the peripheries, over the global South. It is through that the United States will then be able to, say, enact structural adjustment to the World Bank and the IMF and et cetera, right? So the United States is an imperialist power that operates less through that colonial relation that we talked about, more through military and financial power that may lead to indirect forms of power projection over the peripheries. But what it remains at the core for the United States is the imperative of maintaining sovereign power over the flow of capital across the world system, which is at stake today. And West Asia has been central to US power in that way, which is why the United States, I think, has been so concerned with intervening in West Asia, but also with the rise of China, because that is something that also challenges the US sovereign power over the flow of capital in the capitalist world system.
Thank you very much. Christian, do you have any final question for wrap up?
No, I think that concludes it for me. I think there's some things I really want to save for some of our next episode. So I think that's a really good conclusion to the basic question of what is imperialism. And I think we can get into some deeper developments in the other two parts of the series.
Thank you. Well, until next time.